Well, hello, my name is Damian Sheeter, and I live in Orlando, Florida. I'm a pastor here, and I'm grateful to be with you for a few minutes now to talk about work in the biblical narrative. So, when we think about narrative, what do we mean by that, right? You may have heard the Bible talked about or described in a narrative, or sometimes we'll talk about the biblical story. I think we mean the same thing by that, narrative or story. But I use narrative because sometimes when we use the word story, we tend to think about story being something that's made up. Well, of course, not all stories are made up. Some stories are true. If I tell you a story about what happened to me yesterday, I'm not making it up. But nevertheless, when you hear people talk about the biblical story or the biblical narrative, we're talking about the same thing. So let's go with narrative for the purpose of this talk. And let's just ask this first question here. What is a narrative? Right? A narrative is a spoken or written account of connected events or a story. Okay, so that's what a narrative is, but how do stories work? And this is really important for our time and what we consider. And what I have here is that stories provide the deepest framework in which the world and human life is to be understood. There's no more fundamental way we understand our lives than in a story. And we know this because, in fact, if I ask you what you did yesterday, you would maybe mention some facts. But if you really wanted to tell me about what happened, you would have no other choice but to tell me a story, right? This is how life works. You think about being around a child and they want to tell you a story, or they want you to tell them a story. Stories are part of our everyday life in ways that we may not recognize. And so, in that sense, stories really do provide the deepest framework in which the world and human life is to be understood. Another way to say that is that stories are what help us make meaning of our experience. Okay. But so let's talk more in detail about the Bible as a narrative. So the Bible does tell one unified story. It presents one cosmic story, and that's important because it's not just that the Bible tells a story from Genesis to Revelation that's unified, which it is that, but also it's telling a story that's so comprehensive that it is a cosmic story. There's not anything in creation, past, present, or future, that isn't included in the story that the Bible tells. The other thing that stories do, that the Bible does, is that in the biblical narrative, we're invited to participate. And that's true in general about stories. If you think about a movie, whatever the arc would be, there's a sense in which we feel invited to participate. Now, in the case of a movie, oftentimes it's our emotions that get caught up in participation. And sometimes we don't even want that, but it happens, right? It's like when I sit down on my couch and watch a movie with any of my kids, if there's a scary part, right, they jump over into my lap and they hold me tight. Why? It's not real. It's not actually happening. But there's something about stories in general that invite participation. And when we talk about the biblical story, it's more than simply our emotions. It's actually everything in our lives, because the biblical story is the real story of the universe. And so, again, to recap, when we talk about the Bible as a narrative, we're saying at least three things. We're saying that the Bible tells one unified story. We're saying that that story is cosmic, that is, it includes everything, past, present, future, anything that exists, and that it invites human beings, particularly, to participate in the narrative. So, some people, many people, in fact, have talked about the Bible having four chapters. Now, some people will add chapters, but for the sake of our talk today, I want to go with the basic four chapter narrative of the biblical story. Okay, so creation, fall, redemption, restoration. I look forward to talking with you all live whenever on August 8th, and I'll be curious to know if this is new to you, or if you've already heard the Bible talked about in a four chapter story. So to run through it, you have creation is the first chapter. So think Genesis 1 and 2. One thing that's important to recognize is when we read Genesis 1 and 2, creation is actually everything that exists that is not God. Sometimes when we think of creation, we think of nature. We'll think of, I want to go out in creation and take a hike, or I want to go to the mountains, or I want to go to the beach. because I want to be in creation. Now, of course, that is true. When you do that, you are in creation. Really, that's creation includes the things that are seen and the things that are unseen. It includes everything that exists. So that's really important because God is creator of all things. What that also means is that when we see in Genesis 3, when sin enters the world, oftentimes the second chapter is called fall or rebellion. But this is when sin enters the world. And the reason it's important to understand creation comprehensively, that is to say, it's everything that exists that's not God, is that when sin entered the world, it infected, like a virus, everything in the world, right? So Romans 8 even talks about the fact that the creation groans with longing until humanity is fully redeemed. So there's something mysterious that's going on there. But that's an important principle for what we will unpack in the rest of our time together, that not only is creation comprehensive, but sin is comprehensive. Everything is affected, which then means when God redeems his people and all of creation, redemption is also comprehensive. Okay. And then restoration is when the new heavens and the new earth are established and sin is no more and the resurrection of the dead has happened. So this is the fourth chapter. Okay. So the Bible can be broken simply into these four chapters: creation, fall, redemption, and restoration. So I want to ask a question here. We'll come back in a moment to the image of the four chapters. But here's my question. First, imagine you were given a novel, so a fiction book, a novel to read. Here it is. I'm going to give it to you to read, but I've ripped out the first and last pages. I could even say I've ripped out the first and last chapters, which would be more aggressive. But the first page is gone, the last page is gone. So we could ask ourselves, what challenges would we encounter as we tried to understand that story? We would know lots of true details about the story, but we wouldn't quite understand how it all got started and how it ends up. Now, it's really important to know how a story gets started because it's important in a story, in any narrative, to understand where things have fallen from. Because in every story, there's going to be a fall or a problem. Okay, in our case, in the biblical narrative, it's sin. And so we can only fully understand sin and how big of a deal it is if we understand that when God created, he said all things were very good. Okay, and then of course, if we don't know how the story is going to end, we don't know who wins. And in the story, in the nature of the biblical story, we actually have all four chapters, but oftentimes we will emphasize or we will hear others emphasize in our contexts only two chapters, right? We have our favorite chapters or our go-to chapters that we talk about in the biblical narrative. And we tend to minimize or marginalize the other two chapters. So that would lead me, if we were talking right now, and we can when we're live, we might engage these questions. What chapters do you hear the most in your context? Remember, there are four: creation, fall, redemption, restoration. But which chapters do you hear the most in your context? And then I could ask, what chapters do you find yourself emphasizing and why? Why do you emphasize those chapters? Well, let's imagine this. Let's imagine that you were, let's see if I can do this here. Yeah, so I would say in my experience, and I'll be interested to hear your experience, fall and redemption are emphasized. In other words, we say, oh, look, turned into a circle. Okay, so we say that I'm a sinner and Jesus is my savior, and that's all we talk about. So I'm a sinner, Jesus is my savior, or we are all sinners, Jesus can save us, or you're a sinner, Jesus saves you. And we tend to only talk about these two chapters. But what that means is that we leave out creation and restoration. Okay. Now that would be like leaving out the first and last chapters of a novel. Now it is true that there are some traditions that actually minimize this. They minimize the middle two chapters. They don't talk about sin. They don't talk much about redemption. They talk about the goodness of creation, and they talk about a day, maybe a utopia, a day when all things will be good and made new. But the problem here, of course, is that if we minimize sin and our need of redemption in Jesus, then we actually miss these crucial chapters of the biblical story. So what we need to be aware of is which chapters do we tend to emphasize and why, okay? And when we talk about work in the biblical narrative, or when we talk about anything in the biblical narrative, we really need to consider the thing, in this case, work, how it relates to all four chapters. Because if we don't relate it to all four chapters, we'll tell an incomplete story, and our understanding of, in this case, work will be impoverished. All right. So let's keep going and let's do just that. Let's talk about work and let's briefly walk through creation, fall, redemption, restoration. So let's talk about first chapter, creation. And what we'll see in creation actually is that God is the first worker. It'd be interesting. Consider this. Oftentimes, I'll ask students or friends that when we're talking about this, I will say, "Who is the first worker in the Bible?" And oftentimes, not all the time, but oftentimes, our first answer is Adam was the first worker in the Bible. But in fact, God is. Oh, didn't mean to do that. In fact, God is the first worker. Okay, and let's. Eugene Peterson has a great quote here. He says, "The Bible begins with the announcement, in the beginning, God created, not he sat majestic in the heavens. No, he created. He did something. He made something. He fashioned heaven and earth." I love those words, right? He created, he made, he fashioned. The week of creation was a week of work. We live in a universe, in a history where God is working. Before anything else, work is an activity of God. Isn't that so powerful? So what we actually see is that God is the first worker in the scriptures. But of course, right after that, even in the first chapter, on the sixth day of creation, this is from Genesis 1, God said, "Let us make man in our image, after our likeness, and let them," that is mankind, man and woman, "let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the heavens, and over the livestock, and over all of the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth." So God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him, male and female, he created them. So here's the picture. In creation, you have a God who creates, who makes, who fashions. He forms the earth. He separates the sea and the land, the sky, all of these things, right? He's forming the earth, and then he begins to fill the earth with animals and creeping and crawling things, all types of things, birds of the heavens. And then on the sixth day, he creates man and woman, and he says, "I have a job for you. I want you to be my co-worker. I've formed the earth and have begun to fill it. Now I want you to form and fill. I want you to fill the earth. I want you to have dominion, be fruitful, and multiply." So we have God as the first creator, but now he's invited man and woman to co-create with him, to be co-workers, right? This is before the fall has ever entered. So let's continue with creation. The humans are given this great privilege and responsibility to develop the work that God had started. So God has formed the earth, but the earth wasn't perfect, right? The earth was ready with all of this potential for humankind to uncover. Adam and Eve are called to tend the garden and cultivate the soil, but it's God who brings the rain and causes the seed to sprout. So you see here that it's not that God has turned over the keys, as it were, to human beings, but we're still co-creating. God gives humankind an immense amount of agency, and we work with our hands. We develop, we create, we think hard, we work hard, and yet we're still dependent upon God. And we see that here. Because again, Adam and Eve, they tend the garden, they cultivate the soil, they do their work, they exercise their agency, but it's God who brings the rain. And we know rain is crucial, right? And he causes the seed to sprout. So that's important for us to recognize. And then in chapter 2, verse 19, God brings the animals to Adam, but Adam names them. So here's this other picture of God working with man, brings the animals before Adam, but he tasks Adam with this task of dominion. And naming something is a very important task of dominion, of meaning making. Okay, so I think there's one more slide here on creation. Let's keep going. We see the beautiful and honoring privilege of working as a human being. In other words, in Genesis 1 and 2, the Bible depicts work as God honoring and dignifying to human beings. It's a privilege to work. It's a privilege to work. And in fact, a primary way we as human beings love our neighbors and image God is going to be through our daily work. That was true before the fall, and certainly we experience it now after the fall. And we'll talk about how we can consider work now that sin has entered the world. But before we do, I think it's important to say that oftentimes when we think of work, we think of the work of our hands that we get compensated for, that we're paid to do. But in fact, of course, in the garden, when work was good, nobody's getting paid. They were subsistence living in a sense, right? They were farming. And at that point, there was no economy in the way that we'd understand it. And so it's important for us to know that when we consider work, we're not talking about only the work we get paid for, but all of our work. Okay. And that would include, I just have a simple list here: changing diapers, cutting the grass, taking a meal to someone. Because to be human is to engage in the world. And to engage in the world is to engage in the gift of work. It doesn't matter if you're planting a garden, if you're cleaning your apartment or your house, you are engaging in the gift of work to bring order out of chaos, to love fellow human beings, and to glorify God. So work is an amazing gift. Now, we do know that the next chapter after creation is fall, but it's important for us to understand all of the next chapters, that is fall, redemption, restoration. We can only understand them in light of creation. We cannot understand the other chapters fully unless we start at the beginning, okay? So we did start at the beginning, so now let's talk about sin and understand it in relation to what we learned about work and creation. So Genesis 3 is when we have the fall, right? That's when Adam and Eve believed the serpent's lies. And I have here that the serpent's lie was like a virus called sin, and it began to infect the earth. But it first started in the hearts of Adam and Eve, and it attacked the work of God in creation, right? Because it corrupted the co-workers of God. Now, it's important to say, I have here sin is anti-creation. It is anti-creation. That is to say, if creation was a project from God and human beings to bring order out of chaos, sin creates chaos. It always disintegrates. It always fragments. It fragments your own heart, where it's divided between loving God and other idols. It can fragment relationships. It fragments the relationship between human beings and creation. And so sin is anti-creation because it's anti-God. Okay. So it wants to bring chaos, not order. Jesus says that the evil one brings death and not life, right? So that's the fundamental difference. So it corrupts God's coworkers, and sin corrupted God's creation because sin is by nature anti-creational and anti-God. And when it has its effects, it undoes the good order of God and creates chaos. So this is just a more succinct way of noting what I just said. It turns things in on themselves and it distorts God's good design. Sin corrupts us as God's co-workers because rather than joining God in our work from a heart of gratefulness and fullness, we begin to need our work to validate us and to give us worth. Rather than serving our neighbor through our work, we forget our neighbor and make our work about ourselves and our identity. And of course, this can be for the work we get paid for, but can it also be the work of serving a spouse? It could be the work of being a caregiver for an older parent. It could be the work of parenting in general. There's a sense in which we have to, we make the work of our hands, even if it's loving and caring for others, about us. We need to be, it forms our identity in a way that it shouldn't. And so these are some of the ways that sin has corrupted our work. And so these would be good questions to consider. And that is, what are ways sin has disrupted God's plan given to humanity? Clearly, I've talked about some, but there are so many other ways, right? We could talk about the way in which the earth is exploited. We could talk about broken systems of government, laws, unfair systems, injustice. We could talk about lots of ways, but all of those would be included as the ways that sin has disrupted God's good plan. Now, sometimes people will consider for a moment, okay, do we need to understand God's mandate to his image bearers, do we need to consider that void after sin entered the world? In other words, are we in such a completely different situation now that sin has entered the world that something about what God said to human beings no longer matters, or that it's void? Okay. So in other words, a simple way of saying it is, some might be curious or even say, does work matter now after the fall? Sorry, I thought I paused the recording, but I only paused my screen share. Sorry, I had something in my throat. So the way the question could go is, does work matter after the fall, or has it fundamentally changed? Well, let's look in the fact that Genesis 9, which is after sin has entered the world, right? We've had chapter 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8 already talking about the way sin is moving throughout the world and bringing its wreckage. But then God, after the flood, he reaffirms his mandate to humanity. Let's see some of the same language here. God blessed Noah and his sons and said to them, this looks familiar, right? Be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. That's exact language that he gave to Adam and Eve. The fear of you and the dread of you shall be upon every beast of the earth and upon every bird of the heavens, upon everything that creeps on the ground, all the fish of the sea. Right? This is all language, chapter 1. And into your hand they are delivered, every moving thing that food, and as I gave you the green plants, I give you everything, beings to be human beings. Now, we already know that there's now, everything is now cursed. And so the experience is different, and we need redemption in a way that we didn't need redemption before the fall. But human beings don't stop being human beings after the fall. God's desire for creation doesn't stop after the fall. It's broken, it's wounded, it's infected, you could say, with sin. But God still has this mandate for humanity. So then let's make the transition to redemption, okay? Because we've seen that creation is everything that's not God. We've seen that the fall affects everything in creation. So that means that the third chapter, redemption, also is comprehensive. It includes everything, not just souls. Okay, it includes everything. Now, I have here that the Bible makes it clear that God intends to restore everything, right? This restore, this re-word, there are a lot of re-words in the Bible. Redemption is one, reconciliation is one, and there are many others. In this case, restore everything. And I want to read this passage from Colossians 1, chapter 15 through 20. Before I read it, I want to zoom out and get the big picture. And I've highlighted the big picture. And then I'll zoom in and sort of just to drive the point home, and we'll read particulars in the passage. But the big picture I want you to see is that in Colossians 1, Paul says that Jesus, he is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of all creation, and by him all things were created. So all things were created. Again, creation is everything that's not God. So the potential in the earth, art, beauty, systems, what we would develop into government and so on. Jesus, through him, all things were created. And I want to jump to the end here. And through him to reconcile all things, right here. So Jesus is the creator of all things. He's also the redeemer of all things, right? It goes on, whether on earth or in heaven, making peace by the blood of his cross. So what Jesus accomplished on the cross was the redemption of human beings, you and me, all who trust in him, and all of creation. And sometimes that can get lost when we only emphasize fall and redemption, because we therefore marginalize creation and the new creation, right? Chapters 1 and 4. So the big picture is Jesus created all things and he's redeeming all things. And I want to point out the amount of times the word all shows up in this passage. So look at this. He's the firstborn of all creation. For by him all things were created in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions or rulers or authorities, all things were created through him and for him, and he is before all things. And in him all things hold together. He's the head of the body, the church. He's the beginning, the firstborn from the dead, that in everything he might be preeminent. For in him all the fullness of God was pleased to dwell, and through him to reconcile to himself all things. So we get the picture. Redemption is comprehensive because creation was comprehensive, and Jesus created all things, and he's redeeming all things. So the first thing we need to know about redemption is that it is comprehensive, just like creation and just like the fall. So in redemption, in this comprehensive redemption, God is in the business of putting right the whole cosmos, bringing order out of chaos, resolving conflict, restoring relationships, working for justice and just solutions in all situations. And we, as image bearers, and particularly as redeemed image bearers, are called to participate as redemptive agents with God in this restoration project through all of our work, right? Because all of the work of human beings was to take in creation God's image throughout the world. And now in redemption, God's restored image bearing humanity is called to now participate as redemptive agents. Now we could ask ourselves, why would God do this? Why would God not just snap his fingers and do it? Well, we understand a little more of that when we understand the role that he's given human beings in creation. And he's now giving human beings a role in redemption as means. Okay. So I want to read this quote from Daniel Strange. And here's the key idea. Christians are united to Jesus by faith, and we get our old job back, he says. We are restored to our role as rulers over creation because on our behalf, Jesus did what we couldn't, and now we are in him. In Christ, culture is our calling. Our new identity of being in Christ encompasses everything. Whether you eat or drink or whatever you do, do it all for the glory of God. The gospel of Jesus Christ confronts, reclaims, and builds culture in a wonderful variety of ways, but which all conform to God's norms and for his glory. I think this is a powerful quote to sum up what it looks like for human beings to be co-workers with God in redemption, particularly Christians who are united to Jesus. So that's chapter 3. And let's briefly talk about the fourth chapter, new creation. And this passage, various passages here from Revelation 21, 1 and 4, rather than reading all of the passage, which I hope is familiar to you, and I would invite you to read it, I want to highlight a few things. And in fact, I've bolded them. So first, we'll notice that coming down out of heaven from God, coming down is really, really important. What is coming down? Behold, the dwelling place of God is with man. Now, this is really important because we have this new heaven and this new earth, this holy city, New Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven. Oftentimes, we tend to think of human beings going up to heaven. And while there is a sense in which that's true, ultimately, at the end, once we get to the new creation, chapter 4, and the end of history happens, it's actually not us that go up to God. What's emphasized in the Bible is that God comes down to us, just like he did in creation. In this case, the new city that God is preparing comes down out of heaven from God. We don't go up to the new city. Here he continues, John continues, the dwelling place of God is with man. Now, again, think about this. It's not that the dwelling place of man is with God, although that could be true in a sense. The Bible is trying to emphasize that man never ascends to God. God always descends to man. And that's true even new creation. The dwelling place of God is with man. He's coming down. He will dwell with them and they will be his people, and God himself will be with them as their God. And then later on in this chapter, we see this amazing passage where somehow, it's a mysterious to us, but somehow the work of human culture will be purified and presented and have a place in the new creation. Look at this. Read this with me right here. And I saw no temple in the city, for its temple is the Lord God, the Almighty, and the Lamb. And the city has no need of sun or moon to shine on it, for the glory of God gives it light, and its lamp is the Lamb. But by its light will the nations walk, and here, and the kings of the earth, so say, will bring their glory into it. And its gates will never be shut by day, and there will be no night there. They will bring into it the glory and honor of the nations. This is culture making. And somehow there's continuity between what we as human beings create and what lasts into the new creation. One theological principle that I am quoting by Herman Bavinck is that grace restores and perfects nature. Now, this is what this means. What we need to get from this is that the work of grace, or that is God's action in the world, is to restore and perfect nature. So in other words, grace is only opposed to sin. It's not opposed to creation. And so there's sin in the world, but there's grace in the world. But guess what? There is grace in the church, but there's also sin in the church. And where sin is, grace is always opposed to it. So the way that God's grace works in redemption in human beings and in all things is that grace restores and perfects nature. That is, it ultimately brings creation to its fullest conclusion. So in sanctification, what that means is that human beings, we get a new and dignified, renewed humanity when we are redeemed, when God's grace enters us in a saving way. But then we also know that we will, in the end, be perfected. But when we're perfected, we won't be more than human. We'll be fully human. In the same way, when creation is perfected in the new heaven and the new earth, creation won't be something other than creation. It will just be a sinless creation. Another quote here from a scholar named Brian Mattson to sort of bring this home is that if grace is our happily ever after, think of the fourth chapter, it flows from nature's once upon a time. So that's creation, that's the first chapter. And then in the middle, the perfection brought by Jesus Christ is a perfection God has always intended for his creation. God's work of redemption after the fall was not a plan B. He didn't change the plot or come up with something unrelated to his original purposes. The whole point of redemption is that God maintained his purposes for creation so much. He so loved the world that he was willing to die to make it happen. And so we see the importance then of understanding sin and redemption in their proper places in the middle of the first chapter and the last chapter, that is creation and new creation. And so in conclusion, some questions that would be good to discuss, that maybe we could discuss when we're live, is how does knowing that you are created in the image of God who works, right, of a God who works, how does that change the way you view your work? Or in what ways does your work serve to create and cultivate culture? That would be another important question to consider. What about how have you experienced the brokenness of work in a fallen world, right? Because work is very broken. We experience curse as well in our work. What about how does recognizing the brokenness of work change the way you view your work or workplace? You could also say, how does this change my expectations? And really, it should, as a hint, it should change your expectations on both sides. In other words, work, you should never be hopeless in the work of your hands, but we also shouldn't put our hope in the work of our hands, right? We need to, understanding the 4-chapter story can keep us from those two ditches. And then these last two questions, God's redemption through Jesus is comprehensive. We've talked about that. Creation is comprehensive, redemption is comprehensive. So how does this change the way you inhabit your work in all of life? And last, what are ways you can be faithfully present in your spheres of influence? Okay, so that was a relatively quick walkthrough here of work in the biblical story, the way narrative works, the way it invites our participation, the importance of all 4 chapters, and that work, God is the first worker, we are his co-workers, and that continues on even after the fall. So that's the talk. I look forward to being with you guys on August 8th.